Welcome back to the channel where we bring the most iconic action stories to life. Today we are diving into a true movie story, Isang Tsuper Taxi minus 1990 action comedy film Paquito Diaz, Bella Flores, Jamie Fabregas, Subas Herrero, Fernando Poe Jr., Raul Vernal, Dencio Padilla, Loyzag, Bing Loyzaga, and Raymart Santiago in Isang Tsuper Taxi, 1990. Ride along with Nanding, an honest and brave taxi driver whose simple life takes an unexpected turn. Forced to fight for justice and protect his family and friends, he embarks on a journey filled with action and drama. Francisco Bustillos Diaz Sr., May 28, 1932 to March 3, 2011, known professionally as Paquito Diaz, was a veteran Filipino actor and movie director. He specialized in antagonist roles for both action and comedy films. Diaz was born in Araya, Pampanga, Philippines to Sovino Diaz and Maria Bustillos. According to his grandson Kiko Estrada, who chose to be tattooed with a memorial butterfly in his honor, Diaz also lived as dweller under a Mexico, Pampanga bridge, for. He had 8 siblings, including Romy Diaz. He was famous for his villain roles, although he also had the ability to portray protagonist roles, mostly supporting, or as comic relief alongside his longtime friend Fernando Poe Jr. Among the memorable non-villain roles he portrayed were in Walang Matigas na Tinapay sa Minute na Cape, where his brother Romy and Dindo Arroyo played the main villains of the film, and on Dalapesa, without his mustache. Other non-villain appearances include Bobo Cop is a comedy film where he plays the role as a police officer which starring Joey Marquez with Max Alvarado as the main villain, Eagle Squad, where he played a dedicated and good police officer alongside Robin Padilla, Jingoy Estrada, Eder Manzano, Ricky Devo, and Monsieur Del Rosario with Jamie Fabregas as the main antagonist. He portrayed his role as an NBI informer in Dorin de Robo, NBI which starring Eddie Garcia with Eddie Gutierrez as the corrupt police chief superintendent, Squala, as the father of the character of his son Joko with John Regala and Dick Israel portraying the villains, Viagra brothers. Viagra is a pun of Viagra, alongside Jimmy Santos and Berting Labra. He plays the role of Ramon, an office manager in the comedy film Gala na Ang Bala para sa Akin which starred Vic Soto and Panchito Alba with Raul Vernal as the main antagonist. Estudiant Blues, also as the father of the character of his son Joko, and Para o Bayon as Don Juanito, starring Willie Revillame, John Estrada and Randy Santiago with Mark Gill as the right-hand man of his character and the main antagonist of that film. He also appeared in villain roles in comedy films as the main antagonist and also in supporting/non-villain roles that stars mostly Dolphy, Redford White, Vic Soto, Joey Marquez, Herbert Bautista, Joey De Leon, Jimmy Santos, and the late actors Chitito, Babalu, Panchito and Rene Requiestas. He also gained popularity in the 1990s where he played title roles in 2 comedy films, Daddy Goon, touted as his launching film, where he was supported by Herbert Bautista, Manolin Raines, Eddie Gutierrez, villain, and child performer Isa Segura, and The Good, the Bad and the Ugly where he shared billing with Gabby Concepcion and comedian Rene Requiestas. He also tried his hand in producing a film in 2002 via NGA Batang Lansangan, Nayon which starred his son Joko and man-may idol Bobby Andrews. Later life and death. After suffering from hypertension, which at one time left him comatose, he had to sell the family house and lawn including his car. His vision was impaired for the same health reasons. He was diagnosed with pneumonia and sepsis. 5. He suffered a hemorrhagic stroke in 2002 and died on March 3, 2011, at the age of 78, due to complications from pneumonia. His father was a Mexican-American. His brother Romy was also an actor, as well as his wife, Nina, and children, Joko and Cheska, who are also actors. Before Diaz became an actor, he was a basketball player with the Neo Blue Eagles from 1955 to 1956 and FEUD Baby Tamaras. Filipinos, Filipino, mga Pilipino, 51, are citizens or people identified with the country of the Philippines. Filipinos come from various Austronesian peoples, all typically speaking Filipino, English, or other Philippine languages. Despite formerly being subject to Spanish administration, less than 1% of Filipinos are fluent in Spanish, 52. Currently, there are more than 185 ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines, each with its own language, identity, culture, tradition, and history. Names. See also, Names of the Philippines. The name Filipino, as a demonym, was derived from the term Las Islas Filipinas, the Philippine Islands, 53, the name given to the archipelago in 1543 by the Spanish explorer and Dominican priest Ruy López de Villalobos, in honor of Philip II of Spain, 54. During the Spanish period, natives of the Philippine Islands were usually known in the Philippines itself by the generic terms Indio, Indian, native of the East Indies, or Indigena, indigenous, 55, while the generic term Chino, Chinese, 56, 57, short for Indio Chino, was used in Spanish America to differentiate from the Native American Indios of the Spanish territories in the Americas and the West Indies. The term Filipino was sometimes added by Spanish writers to distinguish the Indio-Chino native of the Philippine archipelago from the Indio of the Spanish territories in the Americas, 56, 58, 54. The term Indio-Filipino appears as a term of self-identification beginning in the 18th century, 54. In 1955, Agnes Newton Keith wrote that a 19th-century edict prohibited the use of the word Filipino to refer to Indios. This reflected popular belief, although no such edict has been found. 54. The idea that the term Filipino was not used to refer to Indios until the 19th century has also been mentioned by historians such as Sela Jubea, 59, and Renato Constantino, 60. However, in a 1994 publication, the historian William Henry Scott identified instances in Spanish writing where Filipino did refer to Indio natives. 61. Instances of such usage include the Relation de las Islas Filipinas, 1604, of Pedro Chirino, in which he wrote chapters entitled, Of the Civilities, Terms of Courtesy, and Good Breeding Among the Filipinos, Chapter 16, of the Letters of the Filipinos, Chapter 17, concerning the false heathen religion, idolatries, and superstitions of the Filipinos, Chapter 21, of marriages, dowries, and divorces among the Filipinos, Chapter 30, 62, while also using the term Filipino to refer unequivocally to the non-Spaniard natives of the archipelago, like in the following sentence. The first and last concern of the Filipinos in cases of sickness was, as we have stated, to offer some sacrifice to their anitos or diwatas, which were their gods. 63. Pedro Chirino, Relation de las Islas Filipinas. In the Chronicas, 1738, of Juan Francisco de San Antonio, the author devoted a chapter to the letters, languages, and politeness of the Filipinos, while Francisco Antolin argued in 1789 that the ancient wealth of the Filipinos is much like that which the Igorots have at present. 54. These examples prompted the historian William Henry Scott to conclude that during the Spanish period, the people of the Philippines were called Filipinos when they were practicing their own culture, or, to put it another way, before they became Indios. 54. William Henry Scott, Burundi, 16th century Philippine culture and society. While the Philippine-born Spaniards during the 19th century began to be called Españoles Filipinos, logically contracted to just Filipino, to distinguish them from the Spaniards born in Spain, they themselves resented the term, preferring to identify themselves as hijos del país, sons of the country, Doc. 54. In the latter half of the 19th century, ilustrados, an educated class of mestizos, both Spanish mestizos and Sangley Chinese mestizos, especially Chinese mestizos, and indios arose whose writings are credited with building Philippine nationalism. These writings are also credited with transforming the term Filipino to one which refers to everyone born in the Philippines, 64-65, especially during the Philippine Revolution and American colonial era, and the term shifting from a geographic designation to a national one as a citizenship nationality by law, 64-60. Historian Ambeth Ocampo has suggested that the first documented use of the word Filipino to refer to Indios was the Spanish-language poem A la Juventud Filipina, published in 1879. By José Rizal, 66, writer and publisher Nick Joaquin has asserted that Luis Rodriguez Varela was the first to describe himself as Filipino in print, 67. Apolinario Mabini, 1896, used the term Filipino to refer to all inhabitants of the Philippines. Father José Burgos earlier called all natives of the archipelago as Filipinos, 68. In Wenceslao Retana's Diccionario de Filipinismos, he defined Filipinos as follows, 69. Todos los nacidos en Filipinas sin distinción de origen y de raza. All those born in the Philippines without distinction of origin or race. Wenceslao y Retana, Diccionario de Filipinismos, con la revisión de lo que al respecto leva pública de la Real Academia Española. American authorities during the American colonial era also started to colloquially use the term Filipino to refer to the native inhabitants of the archipelago, 70, but despite this, it became the official term for all citizens of the sovereign independent Republic of the Philippines, including non-native inhabitants of the country as per the Philippine Nationality Law, 54. However, the term has been rejected as an identification in some instances by minorities who did not come under Spanish control, such as the Igorot and Muslim Waros, 54-60. The lack of the letter F in the 1940 to 1987 standardized Tagalog alphabet, abacada, caused the letter P to be substituted for F, though the alphabets or writing scripts of some non-Tagalog ethnic groups included the letter F. Upon official adoption of the modern, 28-letter Filipino alphabet in 1987, the term Filipino was preferred over Pilipino. Citation needed. Locally, some still use Filipino to refer to the people and Pilipino to refer to the language, but in international use Filipino is the usual form for both. A number of Filipinos refer to themselves colloquially as Pinoy, feminine, Pinay, which is a slang word formed by taking the last four letters of Filipino and adding the diminutive suffix y. Or the non-gender or gender-fluid form Pinxi, seldom used in the country but used amongst Filipino-American communities. In 2020, the neologism Philippines appeared, a demonym applied only to those of Filipino heritage in the diaspora and specifically referring to and coined by Filipino-Americans, citation needed, imitating Latinx, itself a recently coined gender-inclusive alternative to Latino or Latina. An online dictionary made an entry of the term, applying it to all Filipinos within the Philippines or in the diaspora, 71. In actual practice, however, the term is unknown among and not applied to Filipinos living in the Philippines, and Filipino itself is already treated as gender neutral. The dictionary entry resulted in confusion, backlash and ridicule from Filipinos residing in the Philippines who never identified themselves with the foreign term. Native Filipinos were also called Manila men, or Manila men, by English-speaking regions or Tagalas by Spanish speakers during the colonial era. They were mostly sailors and pearl divers and established communities in various ports around the world. 74, 75. One of the notable settlements of Manila men is the community of St. Malo, Louisiana, founded at around 1763 to 1765 by escaped slaves and deserters from the Spanish Navy. There were also significant numbers of Manila men in northern Australia and the Torres Strait Islands in the late 1800s who were employed in the pearl hunting industries. In Mexico, especially in the Mexican states of Guerrero and Colima, Filipino immigrants arriving to New Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries via the Manila galleons were called Chino, which led to the confusion of early Filipino immigrants with that of the much later Chinese immigrants to Mexico from the 1880s to the 1940s. A genetic study in 2018 has also revealed that around one-third of the population of Guerrero have 10% Filipino ancestry. Left to right, 1. 5 teeth attributed to Homo luzonensis. 2. CCH1, a third metatarsal bone, DEMT3, discovered on May 5, 2007, in Callao Cave, belonging to Homo luzonensis, a species of archaic human. 3. Callao Cave. The oldest archaic human remains in the Philippines are the Callao man specimens discovered in 2007 in the Callao Cave in northern Luzon. They were dated in 2010 through uranium series dating to the late Pleistocene, c. 67,000 years old. The remains were initially identified as modern human, but after the discovery of more specimens in 2019, they have been reclassified as being members of a new species, Homo luzonensis. Migration of the seafaring Austronesian peoples and their languages. The Negritos are descendants of one of the earliest groups of modern humans to reach the Philippines. The Taban Cave remains, along with the Nia Cave remains of Borneo and the Tam Paling remains of Laos, are part of the first Sundaland people, the earliest branch of anatomically modern humans to reach island Southeast Asia at the time of lowered sea levels of Sundaland, with only 1-3 km sea crossing, 89. They entered the Philippines from Borneo via Palawan at around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago. Their descendants are collectively known as the Negrito people, although they are highly genetically divergent from each other. Philippine Negritos show a high degree of Denisovan admixture, similar to Papuans and indigenous Australians, in contrast to Malaysian and Andamanese Negritos, the Orang Asli. This indicates that Philippine Negritos, Papuans, and indigenous Australians share a common ancestor that admixed with Denisovans at around 44,000 years ago. 90. Negritos include ethnic groups like the Ida, including the Acta, Arda, Dumagat, etc., of Luzon, the Adi of Western Visayas, the Batak of Palawan, and the Mamanwa of Mindanao. Today they comprise just 0.03% of the total Philippine population, 91. After the Negritos, were two early Paleolithic migrations from East Asian, Basal Austric, an ethnic group which includes Austroasiatics, people. They entered the Philippines at around 15,000 and 12,000 years ago, respectively. Like the Negritos, they entered the Philippines during the lowered sea levels during the last ice age, when the only water crossings required were less than 3 kilometers wide, such as the Sibuta Strait. 89. They retain partial genetic signals among the Manobo people and the Samaburjo people of Mindanao. The last wave of prehistoric migrations to reach the Philippines was the Austronesian expansion, which started in the Neolithic at around 4,500 to 3,500 years ago, when a branch of Austronesians from Taiwan, the ancestral Malayo-Polynesian speakers, migrated to the Batons Islands and Luzon. They spread quickly throughout the rest of the islands of the Philippines and became the dominant ethno-linguistic group. They had mixed with the earlier settlers, resulting in the modern Filipinos, which though predominantly genetically Austronesian still show varying genetic admixture with Negritos, and vice versa for Negrito ethnic groups which show significant Austronesian admixture. 92-93 Austronesians possessed advanced sailing technologies and colonized the Philippines via seaborne migration, in contrast to earlier groups. 94-95 Austronesian trade networks. Austronesians from the Philippines also later settled Guam and the other islands of maritime Southeast Asia and parts of mainland Southeast Asia. From there, they colonized the rest of Austronesia, which in modern times include Micronesia, coastal New Guinea, island Melanesia, Polynesia, and Madagascar, in addition to maritime Southeast Asia and Taiwan. 95-96 The connections between the various Austronesian peoples have also been known since the colonial era due to shared material culture and linguistic similarities of various peoples of the islands of the Indo-Pacific, leading to the designation of Austronesians as the Malay race, or the brown race, during the age of scientific racism by Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. 97-98-99 Due to the colonial American education system in the early 20th century, the term Malay race is still used incorrectly in the Philippines to refer to the Austronesian peoples, leading to confusion with the non-indigenous Malaya people. 100, 101, 102, 103 Archaic epoch to 1565. Since at least the 3rd century, various ethnic groups established several communities. These were formed by the assimilation of various native Philippine kingdoms, 91, South Asian and East Asian people together with the people of the Indonesian archipelago and the Malay Peninsula, traded with Filipinos and introduced Hinduism and Buddhism to the native tribes of the Philippines. Most of these people stayed in the Philippines where they were slowly absorbed into local societies. Many of the barangay, tribal municipalities, were, to a varying extent, under the de jure jurisprudence of one of several neighboring empires, among them the Malay Srivijaya, Javanese Majapahit, Brunei, Malacca, Tamil Chowa, Kampa and Khmer empires, although de facto had established their own independent system of rule. Trading links with Sumatra, Borneo, Java, Cambodia, Malay Peninsula, Indochina, China, Japan, India, and Arabia. A thalassocracy had thus emerged based on international trade. Even scattered barangays, through the development of inter-island and international trade, became more culturally homogeneous by the 4th century. Hindu-Buddhist culture and religion flourished among the noblemen in this era. In the period between the 7th to the beginning of the 15th centuries, numerous prosperous centers of trade had emerged, including the Kingdom of Namayan, which flourished alongside Manila Bay, 104, 105, Cebu, Iloilo, 106, Butuan, the Kingdom of Sanfotsi situated in Pangasinan, the Kingdom of Luzon now known as Pampanga, which specialized in trade with most of what is now known as Southeast Asia and with China, Japan, and the Kingdom of Ryukyu in Okinawa. From the 9th century onwards, large number of Arab traders from the Middle East settled in the Malay archipelago and intermarried with the local Malay, Bruneian, Malaysian, Indonesian and Luzon and Visayas indigenous populations. 107. In the years leading up to 1000 AD, there were already several maritime societies existing in the islands, but there was no unifying political state encompassing the entire Philippine archipelago. Instead, the region was dotted by numerous semi-autonomous barangays, settlements ranging in size from villages to city-states, under the sovereignty of competing thalassocracies ruled by datus, rajas, or sultans, 108, or by upland agricultural societies ruled by petty plutocrats. Nations such as the Wangdoms of Pangasinan and Mai, as well as Mai's subordinates, the barangay states of Pulalo and Sandaw, the kingdoms of Manila, Namayan, and Tonda, the Kadatuans of Majas, Dapitan, and Cainta, the Rajanates of Cebu, Butuan, and Samalan, and the sultanates of Bayan, Maguindanao, Lanao, and Sulu, existed alongside the highland societies of the Ifugao and Mangian. Some of these regions were part of the Malayan empires of Srivijaya, Majapahit, and Brunei. Datu, the Tagalog Maginoo, the Kapampangan Ginoo, and the Visayan Tumao were the nobility social class among various cultures of the pre-colonial Philippines. Among the Visayans, the Tumao were further distinguished from the immediate royal families or ruling class. Timawa, the Timawa class were free commoners of Luzon and the Visayas who could own their own land and who did not have to pay a regular tribute to a Maginoo, though they would, from time to time, be obliged to work on a Dadu's land and help in community projects and events. They were free to change their allegiance to another Dadu if they married into another community or if they decided to move. Mahalika, members of the Tagalog warrior class known as Mahalika, had the same rights and responsibilities as the Timwa, but in times of war they were bound to serve their Dadu in battle. They had to arm themselves at their own expense, but they did get to keep the loot they took. Although they were partly related to the nobility, the Mahalikas were technically less free than the Timwas because they could not leave a Daju's service without first hosting a large public feast and paying the Daju between 6 and 18 pesos in gold, a large sum in those days. Alipin, commonly described as servant or slave. However, this is inaccurate. The concept of the alipin relied on a complex system of obligation and repayment through labor in ancient Philippine society, rather than on the actual purchase of a person as in Western and Islamic slavery. Members of the alipin class who owned their own houses were more accurately equivalent to medieval European serfs and commoners. By the 15th century, Arab and Indian missionaries and traders from Malaysia and Indonesia brought Islam to the Philippines, where it both replaced and was practiced together with indigenous religions. Before that, indigenous tribes of the Philippines practiced a mixture of animism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Native villages, called barangays, were populated by locals called Timawa, middle class/freemen, and alipin, servants and slaves. They were ruled by rajas, datus, and sultans, a class called Maginoo, royals, and defended by the Maharlika, lesser nobles, royal warriors, and aristocrats. 91. These royals and nobles are descended from native Filipinos with varying degrees of Indo-Aryan and Dravidian, which is evident in today's DNA analysis among Southeast Asian royals. This tradition continued among the Spanish and Portuguese traders who also intermarried with the local populations. 116. The Philippines was governed by the Spaniards. The arrival of Portuguese explorer Fernando Magellan, Portuguese, Fernão de Magalhães, in 1521 began a period of European immigration. During the Spanish period, the Philippines was part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, which was governed and administered from Mexico City. Early Spanish settlers were mostly explorers, soldiers, government officials, and religious missionaries born in Spain and Mexico. Most Spaniards who settled were of Basque ancestry, 126, but there were also settlers of Andalusian, Catalan, and Moorish descent. 127. The Peninsulars, governors born in Spain, mostly of Castilian ancestry, settled in the islands to govern their territory. Most settlers married the daughters of Rajas, Datus, and sultans to reinforce the alliances of the islands. The Janil and Mahalika castes, royals and nobles, in the Philippines prior to the arrival of the Spaniards formed the privileged principalia, nobility, during the early Spanish period. The arrival of the Spaniards to the Philippines, especially through the commencement of the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade that connected the Philippines through Manila to Acapulco in Mexico, attracted new waves of immigrants from China, as Manila was already previously connected to the Maritime Silk Road, as shown in the Selden map, from Quanzhou and Zhengzhou in southern Fujian to Manila. Maritime trade flourished during the Spanish period, especially as Manila was connected to the ports of southern Fujian, such as Yuagan, the old port of Haicheng in Zhengzhou, Fujian. 128, 129. The Spaniards recruited thousands of Chinese migrant workers from Chinchu, Quanzhou, Chiaoqiu, Zhengzhou, Canton, Guangzhou, and Macau called Sanglis, from Hokkien Chinese, Phoeg, Sng Li, lit. Business, to build the colonial infrastructure in the islands. Many Chinese immigrants converted to Christianity, intermarried with the locals, and adopted Hispanized names and customs and became assimilated, although the children of unions between Filipinos and Chinese that became assimilated continued to be designated in official records as mestizos de sangre. The Chinese mestizos were largely confined to the Binondo area until the 19th century. However, they eventually spread all over the islands and became traders, landowners, and moneylenders. Today, their descendants still comprise a significant part of the Philippine population, especially its bourgeois, 130, who during the late Spanish era in the late 19th century produced a major part of the Ilustrado intelligentsia of the late Spanish Philippines, that were very influential with the creation of Filipino nationalism and the sparking of the Philippine Revolution as part of the foundation of the First Philippine Republic and subsequent sovereign independent Philippines, 131, 132. Today, the bulk of the families in the list of the political families in the Philippines have such family background. Meanwhile, the Spanish-era Sanglis, pure ethnic Chinese descendants of which, replenished by later migrants in the 20th century, that preserved at least some of their Chinese culture, integrated together with mainstream Filipino culture, are now in the form of the modern Chinese Filipino community, who currently play a leading role in the Philippine business sector and contribute a significant share of the Philippine economy today. 133, 134, 135, 136, 137, were most in the current list of the Philippines' richest each year comprise Taipan billionaires of Chinese Filipino background, mostly of Hokkien descent, where most still trace their roots back to mostly Jinjiang or Nanan within Quanzhou or sometimes Xiamen, Moy, or Zhengzhou, all within southern Fujian, the Philippines' historical trade partner with mainland China. In the 16th and 17th centuries, thousands of Japanese traders also migrated to the Philippines and assimilated into the local population. 138. Failed verification. Many were assimilated throughout the centuries, especially through the tumultuous period of World War II. Today, there is a small growing Nikkei community of Japanese Filipinos in Davao with roots to the old Little Japan in Mintao or Calinan in Davao City during the American colonial period, where many had roots starting out in abaca plantations or from workers of the Benguet Road, Kenan Road, to Baguio. British forces occupied Manila between 1762 and 1764 as a part of the 7 Years' War. However, the only part of the Philippines which the British held was the Spanish capital of Manila and the principal naval port of Cavite, both of which are located by the Manila Bay. The war was ended by the Treaty of Paris, 1763. At the end of the war, the treaty signatories were not aware that Manila had been taken by the British and was being administered as a British colony. Consequently, no specific provision was made for the Philippines. Instead, they fell under the general provision that all other lands not otherwise provided for be returned to the Spanish Empire. 139, many Indian seaport troops and their British captains mutinied and were left in Manila and some parts of the Ilocos and Cagayan. The Indian Filipinos in Manila settled at Cainta, Rizal, and the ones in the north settled in Isabela. Most were assimilated into the local population. Even before the British invasion, there were already also a large but unknown number of Indian Filipinos, as majority of the slaves imported into the archipelago were from Bengal or southern India. 140, add in Dravidian-speaking South Indians and Indo-European-speaking Bangladeshis into the ethnic mix. Leaders of the reform movement in Spain, left to right, José Rizal, Marcelo H. del Pilar, and Mariano Ponce, circa 1890. Mestizos Sanglay y Chino, Sanglay Chinese or Chinese mestizos, c. 1841. Tipos del País, watercolor by Justiniano Asuncion. A total of 110 Manila Acapulco galleons set sail between 1565 and 1815 during the Philippines' trade with Mexico. Until 1593, 3 or more ships would set sail annually from each port, bringing with them the riches of the archipelago to Spain. European Criollos, Mestizos, and Portuguese, French and Mexican descent from the Americas, mostly from Latin America, came in contact with the Filipinos. Japanese, Indian, and Cambodian Christians who fled from religious persecutions and killing fields also settled in the Philippines during the 17th until the 19th centuries. The Mexicans especially were a major source of military migration to the Philippines, and during the Spanish period they were referred to as Guachinangos, 141, 142, and they readily intermarried and mixed with native Filipinos. Bernal, the author of the book Mexico and Filipinas, contends that they were middlemen, the Guachinangos, in contrast to the Spanish and Criollos, known as Castilla, that had positions in power and were isolated. The Guachinangos, in the meantime, had interacted with the natives of the Philippines, while in contrast, the exchanges between Castilla and native were negligent. Following Bernal, these two groups, native Filipinos and the Castilla, had been two mutually unfamiliar castes that had no real contact between them. He clarifies, however, with the Chinese traders and the Guachinangos, Mexicans. 141. In the 1600s, Spain deployed thousands of Mexican and Peruvian soldiers across the many cities and presidios of the Philippines. 1. With the inauguration of the Suez Canal in 1867, Spain opened the Philippines for international trade. European investors of British, Dutch, German, Portuguese, Russian, Italian, and French nationality were among those who settled in the islands as business increased. More Spaniards and Chinese arrived during the next century. Many of these migrants intermarried with local mestizos and assimilated with the indigenous population. In the late 1700s to early 1800s, Joaquin Martinez de Zuniga, an Augustinian friar, in his two-volume book, Estadismo de las Islas Filipinas, 144-145, compiled a census of the Spanish Philippines based on the tribute counts, which represented an average family of 7 to 10 children, 146, and 2 parents, per tribute, 147, and came upon the following statistics. In the 1860s to 1890s, in the urban areas of the Philippines, especially at Manila, according to burial statistics, As much as 3.3% of the population were pure European Spaniards, and the pure Chinese were as high as 9.9%. The Spanish Filipino and Chinese Filipino mestizo populations also fluctuated. Eventually, many families belonging to the non-native categories from centuries ago beyond the late 19th century diminished because their descendants intermarried enough and were assimilated into and chose to self-identify as Filipinos while forgetting their ancestors' roots. 149. Since during the Philippine Revolution to modern times, the term Filipino was expanded to include everyone born in the Philippines coming from any race, as per the Philippine Nationality Law, 150-151, that would explain the abrupt drop of otherwise high Chinese, Spanish and mestizo percentages across the country by the time of the first American census in 1903, 152. By the 20th century, the remaining ethnic Spaniards and ethnic Chinese, replenished by further Chinese migrants in the 20th century, now later came to compose the modern Spanish Filipino community and Chinese Filipino community respectively, where families of such background contribute a significant share of the Philippine economy today. 133, 134, 2, 136, 137, where most in the current list of the Philippines' richest each year comprise billionaires of either Chinese Filipino background or the old elite families of Spanish Filipino background. Late modern Filipino women in Filipiniana dress, Manila, 1899. After the defeat of Spain during the Spanish-American War in 1898, Filipino General Emilio Aguinaldo declared independence on June 12, while General Wesley Merritt became the first American governor of the Philippines. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris formally ended the war, with Spain ceding the Philippines and other territories to the United States in exchange for $20 million, 153, 154. A native Filipino with Chinese, American/European and Japanese settlers in the Philippines, 1900. The Philippine-American War resulted in the deaths of at least 200,000 Filipino civilians, 155. Some estimates for total civilian dead reach up to 1,000,000, 156, 157. After the Philippine-American War, the United States civil governance was established in 1901, with William Howard Taft as the first American Governor-General. 158. A number of Americans settled in the islands and thousands of interracial marriages between Americans and Filipinos have taken place since then. Owing to the strategic location of the Philippines, as many as 21 bases and 100,000 military personnel were stationed there since the United States first colonized the islands in 1898. These bases were decommissioned in 1992 after the end of the Cold War, but left behind thousands of Amerasian children. 159. The country gained independence from the United States in 1946. The Pearl S. Buck International Foundation estimates there are 52,000 Amerasians scattered throughout the Philippines. However, according to the Center of Amerasian Research, there might be as many as 250,000 Amerasians scattered across the cities of Clark, Angeles City, Manila, and Olongapo. 160. In addition, numerous Filipino men enlisted in the U.S. Navy and made careers in it, often settling with their families in the United States. Some of their second or third generation families returned to the country. Following its independence, the Philippines has seen both small and large-scale immigration into the country, mostly involving American, European, Chinese, and Japanese peoples. After World War II, South Asians continued to migrate into the islands, most of which assimilated and avoided the local social stigma instilled by the early Spaniards against them by keeping a low profile or by trying to pass as Spanish mestizos. This was also true for the Arab and Chinese immigrants, many of whom are also post-World War II arrivals. More recent migrations into the country by Koreans, Persians, Brazilians, and other Southeast Asians have contributed to the enrichment of the country's ethnic landscape, language, and culture. Centuries of migration, diaspora, assimilation, and cultural diversity made most Filipinos accepting of interracial marriage and multiculturalism. Philippine nationality law is currently based upon the principle of jus sanguinis and, therefore, descent from a parent who is a citizen of the Republic of the Philippines is the primary method of acquiring national citizenship. Birth in the Philippines to foreign parents does not in itself confer Philippine citizenship, although RA 9139, the Administrative Naturalization Law of 2000, does provide a path for administrative naturalization of certain aliens born in the Philippines. Since many of the above historical groups came to the Philippines before its establishment as an independent state, many have also gained citizenship before the founding of either the First Philippines Republic or Third Republic of the Philippines. For example, many Cold War-era Chinese migrants who had relatives in the Philippines attained Filipino citizenship for their children through marriage with Chinese Filipino families that trace back to either the late Spanish era or American colonial era. Likewise, many other modern expatriates from various countries, such as the U.S., often come to the Philippines to marry with a Filipino citizen, ensuring their future children attain Filipino citizenship and their Filipino spouses ensure property ownership. Social classifications. Icon. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. July 2020, learn how and when to remove this message. During the Spanish period, Spaniards from Spain and Hispanic America mainly referred to Spaniards born in the Philippines, Spanish Filipinos, in Spanish, Filipino/S.M., or Filipina/S.F., 161, 162, 163, 164, 165, excessive citations. In relation to those born in Hispanic America called in Spanish, Americano/S.M., /Americana/S.F., or Criollo/S, whereas the Spaniards born in the Philippines themselves called the Spaniards from Spain as Peninsular/Es, with themselves also referred to as Dinsular/Es. 165. Meanwhile, the caste system hierarchy and taxation system during the Spanish times dictated that those of mixed descent were known as mestizo/S, dem, /mestiza/S, def. Specifically, those of mixed Spanish and native Filipino descent were known as mestizo/S de Español, Spanish mestizos, whereas those of mixed Chinese and native Filipino descent were known as mestizo/S de Sangley, Chinese mestizos, and the mix of all of the above or a mix of Spanish and Chinese were known as tornatras. Meanwhile, the ethnic Chinese migrants, Chinese Filipinos, were historically referred to as Sangley/Es, from Hokkien Chinese, Phoeg, Sng, lit. Business, while the natives of the Philippine Islands were usually known by the generic term Indio/S, 165, lit. Indian, native of the East Indies. Filipinos of mixed ethnic origins are still referred today as mestizos. However, in common popular parlance, mestizos usually refer to Filipinos mixed with Spanish or any other European ancestry. Filipinos mixed with any other foreign ethnicities are named depending on the non-Filipino part. Historically, though, it was the mestizo de Sangley, Chinese mestizo, that numbered the most among mestizos, 166, though the mestizos de Español, Spanish mestizos, carried more social prestige due to the caste system hierarchy that usually elevated Spanish blood and Christianized natives to the peak, while most descendants of the mestizo de sanglé, Chinese mestizo, despite assuming many of the important roles in the economic, social, and political life of the nation, would readily assimilate into the fabric of Philippine society. People classified as blancos, whites, when the insulars or Filipinos, a person born in the Philippines of pure Spanish descent, peninsulars, a person born in Spain of pure Spanish descent, Español mestizos, a person born in the Philippines of mixed Austronesian and Spanish ancestry, and tornatres, a person born in the Philippines of mixed Austronesian, Chinese and Spanish ancestry. Manila was racially segregated, with blancos living in the walled city of Intramuros, unchristianized Sangleys in Parian, Christianized Sangleys and mestizos de Sanglay in Binondo and the rest of the 7,000 islands for the Indios, with the exception of Cebu and several other Spanish posts. Only mestizos de Sanglay were allowed to enter Intramuros to work for whites, including mestizos de Español, as servants and various occupations needed for the colony. Indio were native Austronesians, but as a legal classification, Indio were those who embraced Roman Catholicism and Austronesians who lived in proximity to the Spanish colonies, citation needed. People who lived outside Manila, Cebu, and the major Spanish posts were classified as such. Naturals were Catholic Austronesians of the lowland and coastal towns. The un-Catholic Negritos and Austronesians who lived in the towns were classified as salvajes, savages, or infieles, the unfaithful. Remontados, Spanish for situated in the mountains, and tolasanes, bandits, were indigenous Austronesians and Negritos who refused to live in towns and took to the hills, all of whom were considered to live outside the social order as Catholicism was a driving force in Spanish everyday life, as well as determining social class in the territory. People of pure Spanish descent living in the Philippines who were born in Spanish America were classified as Americanos. Mestizos and Africanos born in Spanish America living in the Philippines kept their legal classification as such and usually came as indentured servants to the Americanos. The Philippine-born children of Americanos were classified as Gins. The Philippine-born children of Mestizos and Africanos from Spanish America were classified based on patrilineal descent. A mestiza de Sanglay woman in a photograph by Francisco Van Camp, circa 1875. The term negrito was coined by the Spaniards based on their appearance. The word negrito would be misinterpreted and used by future European scholars as an ethnoracial term in and of itself. Both Christianized Negritos who lived in the archipelago and unchristianized Negritos who lived in tribes outside were classified as Negritos. Christianized Negritos who lived in Manila were not allowed to enter Intramuros and lived in areas designated for Indios. A person of mixed Negrito and Austronesian ancestry were classified based on patrilineal descent. The father's ancestry determined the child's legal classification. If the father was Negrito and the mother was India, Austronesian, the child was classified as Negrito. If the father was Indio and the mother was Negrita, the child was classified as Dindio. Persons of Negrito descent were viewed as being outside the social order as they usually lived in tribes outside and resisted conversion to Christianity. This legal system of racial classification based on patrilineal descent had no parallel anywhere in the Spanish-ruled territories in the Americas. In general, a son born of a Sanglay male and an Indio or mestizo de Sanglay female was classified as mestizo de Sanglay. All subsequent male descendants were mestizos de Sanglay regardless of whether they married an India or a mestiza de Sanglay. A daughter born in such a manner, however, acquired the legal classification of her husband, i.e., she became an India if she married an Indio but remained a mestiza de sangle if she married a mestizo de sangle or a sangle. In this way, a Chino mestizo male descendant of a paternal sangle ancestor never lost his legal status as a mestizo de sangle no matter how little percentage of Chinese blood he had in his veins or how many generations had passed since his first Chinese ancestor. He was thus a mestizo de sangle in perpetuity. However, a mestiza de sangle, who married a Blanco, Filipino, mestizo de Español, Peninsula, or Americano, kept her status as mestiza de sangle. But her children were classified as tornatras. An India, who married a Blanco, also kept her status as India, but her children were classified as mestizo de Español. A mestiza de Español who married another Blanco would keep her status as mestiza, but her status will never change from mestiza de Español if she married a mestizo de Español, Filipino, or Peninsula. In contrast, a mestizo de sangle or Español man's status stayed the same regardless of whom he married. If a mestizo de sangle or Español married a Filipina, woman of pure Spanish descent, she would lose her status as a Filipina and would acquire the legal status of her husband and become a mestiza de Español or sangle. If a Filipina married an Indio, her legal status would change to India, despite being of pure Spanish descent. The de facto social stratification system based on class that continues to this day in the country had its beginnings in the Spanish area with the discriminating caste system, 167. The insulars, who already saw their distinct identity from the peninsulars, adopted the term Filipino to refer to themselves. And among these insulars Luis Rodriguez y Varela was the first to use it, 168. The use of the term was later adopted by the Spanish and Chinese mestizos or those born of mixed Chinese-Indio or Spanish-Indio descent. Late in the 19th century, José Rizal popularized the use of the term Filipino to refer to all those born in the Philippines, including the Indios, 169, when ordered to sign the notification of his death sentence, which described him as a Chinese mestizo. Rizal refused. He went to his death saying that he was Indio Puro, 170, 169. After the Philippines' independence from Spain in 1898 and the word Filipino, officially, became a nationality that includes the entire population of the Philippines regardless of racial ancestry, as per the Philippine nationality law and as described by Wenceslao Retanas' Diccionario de Filipinismos, where he defined Filipinos as follows, 69. Todos los nacidos en Filipinas sin distinción de origen ni de raza. All those born in the Philippines without distinction of origin or race. The aboriginal settlers of the Philippines were primarily Negrito groups. Negritos today comprise a small minority of the nation's overall population and received significant gene flow from Austronesian groups, as well as an even earlier, Basal East Asian group, while the modern Austronesian-speaking majority population does not, will only marginally show evidence for admixture, and cluster closely with other East/Southeast Asian people. There were also immigrations from Austroasiatic, Papuan, and South Asian peoples, 175. The majority population of Filipinos are Austronesians, linguistic and genetic group whose historical ties lay in maritime Southeast Asia and Southern East Asia, but through ancient migrations can be found as indigenous peoples stretching as far east as the Pacific Islands and as far west as Madagascar off the coast of Africa, 176, 177. The current predominant theory on Austronesian expansion holds that Austronesians settled the Philippine Islands through successive southward and eastward seaborne migrations from the Neolithic Austronesian populations of Taiwan, 178. Other hypotheses have also been put forward based on linguistic, archaeological, and genetic studies. These include an origin from mainland southern China, linking them to the Liangzhu culture and the Taipentang culture, later displaced or assimilated by the expansion of speakers of Sino-Tibetan languages, wink with a frown 179, 180, an in situ origin from the Sundaland continental shelf prior to the sea level rise at the end of the last glacial period, c. 10,000 BC, wink with a frown 181, 182, or a combination of the two, the Nisantal Maritime Trading and Communication Network hypothesis, which advocates cultural diffusion rather than a series of linear migrations. 183. Genetics. Main article, Genetic Studies on Filipinos. The results of a massive DNA study conducted by the National Geographic's, the Genographic Project, based on genetic testings of 80,000 Filipino people by the National Geographic in 2008 to 2009, found that the average Filipino's genes are around 53% Southeast Asia and Oceania, 36% East Asian, 5% Southern European, 3% South Asian and 2% Native American. 184. According to a genetic study done by the Kaiser Permanente (KIPI) research program on genes, environment, and health (RPGH), most self-identified Filipinos sampled have modest amounts of European ancestry consistent with older admixture. 185. Dental morphology. Dental morphology provides clues to prehistoric migration patterns of the Philippines, with cynodont dental patterns occurring in East Asia, Central Asia, North Asia, and the Americas. Syndodont patterns occur in Southeast Asia as well as the bulk of Oceania. 186. Filipinos exhibit syndodonty. 186. 187, and are regarded as having a more generalized dental morphology and having a longer ancestry than its offspring, cynodonty. Historic reports. Filipino members of Knights of Columbus. Published in 1849, the Catalogo Alfabetico de Apellidos contains 141 pages of surnames with both Spanish and Hispanicized indigenous roots. Authored by Spanish Governor-General Narciso Claverio y Zaldúa and Domingo Abella, the catalogue was created in response to the decree of November 21, 1849, which gave every Filipino a surname from the book. The decree in the Philippines was created to fulfill a Spanish colonial decree that sought to address colonial subjects who did not have a last name. This explains why most Filipinos share the same surnames as many Hispanics today, without having Spanish ancestry. Augustinian friar Joaquin Martinez de Zuniga, in the 1800s, measured varying ratios of Spanish mestizos as percentages of the populations of the various provinces, with ranges such as 19.5% of the population of Tanda, the most populous province, to Pampanga, 13.7%, Cavite, 13%, and Bulacan, 10.8%, to as low as 5% in Cebu, and non-existent in the isolated provinces, 144, 145, overall the whole Philippines, even including the provinces with no Spanish settlement, has summed up, the average percentage of Spanish Filipino tributes amount to 5% of the total population, 144, 145. The book, Intercolonial Intimacies Relinking Latin/O America to the Philippines, 1898 to 1964 by Policy, Park, citing, Forzados y Reclutas, Los Criollos Novohispanos en Asia, 1756 to 1808, gave the number of later Mexican soldier immigrants to the Philippines, pegging the number at 35,000 immigrants in the 1700s. 141, in a Philippine population which was only around 1.5 million, 188, thus the Latin Americans, mainly Mexicans, formed 2.33% of the population, 189. In relation to this, a population survey conducted by German ethnographer Fedor Jager concluded that 1/3 of Luzon, which holds half of the Philippines' population, had varying degrees of Spanish and Mexican ancestry, 190. Meanwhile, according to older records held by the Senate of the Philippines, there were approximately 1.35 million ethnic, or pure, Chinese within the Philippine population, while Filipinos with any Chinese descent comprised 22.8 million people, 20% of the population. Recent studies during 2015 record around 220,000 to 600,000 American citizens living in the country, 192. This increased to 750,000 Americans living in the Philippines by year 2025, forming 0.75% of the population, 193. There are also 250,000 Amerasians across Angeles City, Manila, Clark, and Olongapo, forming 0.25% of the population, 194. Together, the total percentage of individuals who possess full or partial American descent form 1% of the total demographics of the Philippines. Languages. Main articles: Languages of the Philippines and Philippine languages. The indigenous, native, Philippine languages spoken around the country that have the largest number of speakers in a particular region, with Tagalog being the largest. Note that on regions marked with black diamonds, the language with the most speakers denotes a minority of the population. Austronesian languages have been spoken in the Philippines for thousands of years. According to a 2014 study by Mark Donoghue of the Australian National University and Tim Denham of Monash University, there is no linguistic evidence for an orderly north-to-south dispersal of the Austronesian languages from Taiwan through the Philippines and into island Southeast Asia, High CA. 181. Many adopted words from Sanskrit and Tamil were incorporated during the strong wave of Indian, Hindu-Buddhist, cultural influence starting from the 5th century BC, in common with its Southeast Asian neighbors. Chinese languages were also commonly spoken among the traders of the archipelago. However, with the advent of Islam, Arabic and Persian soon came to supplant Sanskrit and Tamil as holy languages. Starting in the second half of the 16th century, Spanish was the official language of the country for the more than 3 centuries that the islands were governed through Mexico City on behalf of the Spanish Empire. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Spanish was the preferred language among ilustrados and educated Filipinos in general. Significant disagreements exist, however, on the extent Spanish used beyond that. It has been argued that the Philippines were less Hispanized than Canaries and America, with Spanish only being adopted by the ruling class involved in civil and judicial administration and culture. Spanish was the language of only approximately 10% of the Philippine population when Spanish rule ended in 1898, 195, as a lingua franca or Creole language of Filipinos. Major languages of the country like Chavacano, Cebuano, Tagalog, Tapampangan, Pangasinan, Bicol, Hiligaynon, Wari-Wari, and Ilocano assimilated many different words and expressions from Castilian Spanish. Chavacano is the only Spanish-based Creole language in Asia. Its vocabulary is 90% Spanish, and the remaining 10% is a mixture of predominantly Portuguese, Hiligaynon, and some English. Chavacano is considered by the Instituto Cervantes to be a Spanish-based language. In sharp contrast, another view is that the ratio of the population which spoke Spanish as their mother tongue in the last decade of Spanish rule was 10% or 14%. 197, an additional 60% is said to have spoken Spanish as a second language until World War II, but this is also disputed as to whether this percentage spoke Kitchen Spanish, which was used as marketplace lingua compared to those who were actual fluent Spanish speakers. In 1863, a Spanish decree introduced universal education, creating free public schooling in Spanish, yet it was never implemented, even before the advent of American annexation, 198. It was also the language of the Philippine Revolution, and the 1899 Malolos Constitution proclaimed it as the official language of the First Philippine Republic, albeit a temporary official language. Spanish continued to be the predominant lingua franca used in the islands by the elite class before and during the American colonial regime. Following the American occupation of the Philippines and the imposition of English, the overall use of Spanish declined gradually, especially after the 1940s. According to Ethnologue, there are about 180 languages spoken in the Philippines, 199. The 1987 Constitution of the Philippines imposed the Filipino language, 201, as the national language and designates it, along with the English language, as one of the official languages. Regional languages are designated as auxiliary official languages. The Constitution also provides that Spanish and Arabic shall be promoted on a voluntary and optional basis, 202. Other Philippine languages in the country with at least 1 million native and indigenous speakers include Cebuano, Ilocano, Hiligaynon, Wari, Central Bicol, Kapampangan, Pangasinan, Chavacano, Spanish-based Creole, Albay Bicol, Maranao, Maguindanao, Kinaraye, Taza, Suarganan, Maspatino, Aklanon, and Ibanat. The 28-letter modern Filipino alphabet, adopted in 1987, is the official writing system. In addition, each ethnicity's language has their own writing scripts and set of alphabets, many of which are no longer used, 203. However, there has been a resurgence of these ancient scripts, and initiatives to push the government for standardization. The most prominent script, Baybayin, is a writing system native to the Philippines, with the word baybay meaning to spell, in Tagalog, Bilanber, 2018. Due to Spanish colonization, this script was replaced with the Latin alphabet, which became the standard of the Philippines. In recent times, there has been a large interest in revitalizing Baybayin, with scholars spreading awareness and education online, and artists interpreting this script into their work. According to the National Statistics Office, NSO, as of 2010, over 92% of the population were Christians, with 80.6% professing Roman Catholicism, 205. The latter was introduced by the Spanish beginning in 1521, and during their more than 330-year colonization of the islands, they managed to convert a vast majority of Filipinos, resulting in the Philippines becoming the largest predominantly Catholic country in Asia. There are also large groups of Protestant denominations, which either grew or were founded following the disestablishment of the Catholic Church during the American colonial period. The homegrown Iglesia Ni Cristo is currently the single largest church whose headquarters is in the Philippines, followed by United Church of Christ in the Philippines. The Iglesia Filipina Independiente, also known as the Aglipayne Church, was an earlier development, and is a national church directly resulting from the 1898 Philippine Revolution. Other Christian groups such as the Victory Church, 206, Eddie Villanueva founded and led Jesus is Lord Church, Jesus Miracle Crusade, Mormonism, Orthodoxy, and the Jehovah's Witnesses have a visible presence in the country. The second largest religion in the country is Islam, estimated in 2014 to account for 5% to 8% of the population, 207. Islam in the Philippines is mostly concentrated in southwestern Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, which, though part of the Philippines, are very close to the neighboring Islamic countries of Malaysia and Indonesia. The Muslims call themselves Moros, a Spanish word that refers to the Moors, albeit the two groups have little cultural connection other than Islam. Historically, ancient Filipinos held animist religions that were influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, which were brought by traders from neighboring Asian states. These indigenous Philippine folk religions continue to be present among the populace, with some communities, such as the Ida, Igorot, and Lamad, having some strong adherents and some who mix beliefs originating from the indigenous religions with beliefs from Christianity or Islam. 208, 209. There are temples also for Sikhism, also located in the provinces and in the cities, sometimes located near Hindu temples. 210. As of 2013, religious groups together constituting less than 5% of the population included Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Seventh-day Adventists, United Church of Christ, United Methodists, the Episcopal Church in the Philippines, Assemblies of God, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and Philippine, Southern, Baptists, and the following domestically established churches: the Iglesia ni Cristo, Church of Christ, Philippine Independent Church, Aglapayan, members. Church of God International, Jesus is Lord Church, and the Kingdom of Jesus Christ, the name above every name. In addition, there are Lamad, who are indigenous peoples of various animistic and syncretic religions. Bibibowl of Filipino descent Mekab Ahlorj and Crowing Port of the state of Hawaii's Pobilish. In Alfeni they were the third largest ethnic group and represented Ethneni Shruna fossil femeni Filmiah of the Pobilish, Thedef, but more recently, according to the Alfeni Washara United States Census, they have become the second largest ethnicity in Hawaii. Hamsa Shruna Fasid Wahid Filmiahin Alfani Washar, after weights. According to the Alfani census, the state of Hawaii had Filipino population of over Miateni wa Hamsa wa Sabrina, Siva, Arba, Hamsa, with over Miatin wa Wahid wa Tasona living on the island of Oahu Hamsa, of those, Miatin with Nen were immigrants, Sita, furthermore, Filipinos made up the third largest ethnicity among Asian Pacific Americans, Saba, when making up the majority of the populations of K and Maui counties. Themani, in John Alfani Wathnen, representatives from the Arroyo administration and local leaders presided over the grand opening and dedication of the Filipino Community Center in Waibohu, Tisa. In the Alfani Washara census, Filipino Americans became the largest Asian ethnicity in Hawaii, partially due to the declining of population of the state's Japanese Americans. Ashar, in Alfani Wahad Ashar, 4% of our Filipino immigrants in the U.S. resided in the Honolulu metro area, and were 43% of our immigrants in the Honolulu metro area as well. Filipino immigrants in Hawaii made up 6% of our Filipino immigrants in the United States. A recent study showed that the Philippine Islands may have been a homeland or stopover for the ancient Austronesian-speaking Galabit culture, ancestors of the Bodenegans, thousands of years ago. Best one identified as dressing the Bodenegan as the chickens to the Philippines. Why? A few Filipinos, known as Minutemen, settled in the Kingdom of Hawaii during the 19th century. They mainly worked as cooks and musicians in the Royal Hawaiian Band. No deliberate migration existed during this period, Thedefasha. However, there was an exemplary Minuteman that Hawaii's history has forgotten. His name was Jose Sobislay Borneo. Born in Manila on December 5, 1850, Jose Sobislay Borneo was an important figure and an unsung hero in Hawaiian history. Lay Borneo, a Filipino composer, headed the Royal Hawaiian Band during the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893. He was a close and loyal friend of Queen, the last monarch of whose compositions may have included the Hawaiian protest song, Kalono Enatibo, famous or the Flaz, Kchedra. The song was a collaboration with Hawaiian songwriter Riranoa Right Kikwil Haywikinani Brenda Crust. The importation of Filipinos workers called socadas, which roughly translates to Filipino migrant workers, and also referred to the actual importation of these workers, began in 1906 and continued until 1946. During that time an estimated 125,000 Filipinos were recruited from the Ilocos and Visayas regions of the Philippines to work in Hawaii. Initially, Filipino men were recruited by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, HSB, from the Philippines to Hawaii to work in the sugarcane fields. Later socadas were recruited for work in both sugarcane and cabanaba fields. Filipino migrant workers were recruited to replace Japanese workers that had been caught on strike because of long work hours and substandard living conditions. These ethnic groups were segregated so that Filipinos would not be influenced by the striking Japanese workers, and so the Filipinos could be used as leverage against the striking Japanese. Filipino workers that lacked education and had previous experience in agricultural work were preferred by recruiters because they were perceived to be easier to exploit and control. Socadas were 13-year contract workers and did not have the intention to stay in Hawaii. Most wanted to make their riches and go back home with enough money to pay rent. This was common practice up until the 1947. The contracts gave them passage to Hawaii and then back to the Philippines after their contract was over. In the 1947, the perception of working in Hawaii became cloudy, and so more Filipinos sought to stay in Hawaii. Workers were housed in plantation barracks that they'd paid rent for, worked along Asharashatan Derdas, sitted as Ehawake and were abed to Sona cents a day. They were the lowest paid workers of all the ethnicities working on the plantations. Most socadas were single men's, however, over team socadas would send 4 relatives or bring families with them. The last socadas in 1946 were notable and different compared to all the socadas prior and are referred to as the socada 46. Several factors making the socada 46 different was that it included more women, children and relatives of previous socadas. It was also different in that some had an American colonial education, and professionals were included. Sitasha. Filipino-American World War II veterans during the RONG Kadjiting Kan Memorial Ceremony, Alfani Watasa. Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association. COSO, Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association. Many Filipino farm laborers were recruited to go to Hawaii in 1946 by the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association, HSB, to work on the sugar plantations in Hawaii. 13 Albert F. Judd. In HSB recruiter trade to get 300 Filipinos to work in Hawaii. Those Filipinos were sent to the Aulao plantation on the Big Island of Hawaii, Sabah. The sugar industry was booming at the time, so the northernmost countries of Hawaii and the Philippines were used in concert to support the industry for the United States. By the 1997 there was an average of 7,600 Filipinos arriving in Hawaii annually. 18. Most Filipinos considered themselves temporary residents in Hawaii until around the 1947. The HSB preferred Filipinos to work one sugar plantations because they were known to be hard working and were given the lowest wage of our ethnicities working in the plantations. Treatment. During the early to mid-20th century, 1946 hundreds, if not thousands of Filipino workers, Socadas, migrated to Hawaii to find better work opportunities. As more Socadas migrated to Hawaii, a collective identity formed and they began to see themselves as Filipino Americans. However, in response to this, non-Filipino groups collectively degraded their ethnicity and culture with racial stereotypes. As a result, Filipino-American identity is largely defined by non-Filipinos and has permeated itself within Hawaii society, citation needed. Majority of Filipino workers were predominantly men and upon their racial stereotypes like book knives and the use of their kinship terms, in the native Filipino language, in a derogatory manner merged. Some stereotypes depicted Filipino men particularly as highly emotional, prone to violence and criminally inclined. For example, the book Temperament and Race published in 1926 focused on the temperamented qualities in people and used it to compare traits in various races, more specifically Filipinos. This study can be seen as further demonizing the Filipino men workers in Hawaii. Subsequently, these stereotypes happened frequently in which Filipino men were more likely to be charged for misdemeanors and murder, as well being the number one race in Hawaii to receive the death penalty within the first half of the 20th century. Moreover, Hawaii media like the Honolulu Daily News Biber, Honolulu Store-Boarded, and the radio would specifically target Filipinos as the main perpetrator of violence by highlighting their convictions on front pages furthering the vilification of Filipinos. Historically, economically, and politically, Filipinos during the plantation had could be seen as a subordinate minority. Therefore, Filipino Americans have found it especially difficult to contest the stereotyping that emerged from the early 20th century, as many misrepresentations still exist today. Disaster. Impact on Hawaii's working class. Some native Hawaiians worked alongside Filipinos in the sugar plantations. Since the sugar industry in Hawaii was the main source of income for the working class, there was high demand for these jobs. American sugar plantation owners weren't able to get native Hawaiians to work for them, so they relied heavily on the importation of other ethnicities. Sabasha. Late 20th century. The United States Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 added more Filipinos to bring the family to Hawaii and visited more Filipino rifles, particularly Filipino women, to enter the state. The increase in rifles also caused some backlash, and in the 1967 Filipinos felt discriminated against. They also tended to do more poorly at schools than average in that decade. The reasons why Filipino students underperformed in school in the 1967 is unknown, but discrimination may have contributed. In 1970 of the 1915 Filipinos living in Hawaii, Huni 34% were high school graduates, 21. Former President Fernando Poe spent his last years in Hawaii after his family's 21-year conjugal dictatorship, 22. In the Philippines was arrested in 1986 through the People Revolution, 23. When he fled to Hawaii by way of Guam, 24. He also brought with him 22 crates of cash valued at $17 million, 300 credits of associated duty with undermined value. Durar 400 worth of ancient precious gems contained in Pambas de boxes, 65 seco and cortiti watches, 12 by 4 أقدام box grand vol. Ofrel brels, 3 أقدام solid coed statue covered in diamonds and other precious stones, Durar 200, Siva code body and $1 million in Philippine pesos, and deposits libas tobanics in the Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands worth $124 million, which he will amassed during his dictatorship, 25. Throughout his stay in Hawaii, he and his family enjoyed a high life. Living in a luxurious house while shopping and eating in one of the state's most expensive sections, as his wife imed. And attend cast various costly parties, 26. Why Filipinos back in the Philippines suffered from the debt the Marcos family incurred during the role, which experts say may be avoided but by Alfani wa 25. 3 decades after the downfall of the Marcos authoritarian regime, 27. Demographics and socioeconomics. The Alfani census showed that Filipinos surpassed Japanese as Hawaii's largest racial group. The total population of Filipinos was 392,495 of which 197,497 were full Filipinos. The total population of Japanese was 312,292 of which 185,502 were full Japanese, 28. Wahid. According to surveys conducted by the American Community Survey showed that Filipinos overtook Japanese between 2007 and 2008, 29. Dinitsuji Sarananayo, a Filipino-American academic from Hawaii, has criticized what he views as the colonial amnesia of the Filipino settler community in relation to native Hawaiians. Thanathon, he writes, Filipinos in Hawaii lack social, economic, and political power, yet we often seek empowerment as Americans within a U.S. settler state. Why Filipino communities must continue to resist oppressive systems that perpetuate various inequalities. We must also be aware of the colonial structures ingrained in U.S. nationalism that render invisible the U.S. violation of native Hawaiians' human rights to self-determination. In 2020, there were 383,200 Filipino Americans in Hawaii, 31, a quarter of the population of Hawaii or Filipino Americans, 32, 33. In 2019 Filipino Americans were the second largest ethnicity in Hawaii, after European Americans, 34, despite Filipino Americans in Hawaii having a slightly higher median family income. The Filipino per capita income, $27 in Hawaii is significantly lower than the total population, $36 In addition to this, Filipino Americans in Hawaii were significantly less likely to attain a bachelor's degree. There is no indication of socioeconomic mobility among the subordinate groups like Filipinos, Samoans, Hawaiians. Filipino Americans, and other immigrant minorities have been restricted access to opportunities. This thereby maintains them in their subjugated position, allowing service and other blue-collar jobs that preclude their socioeconomic mobility. 34. The majority of Filipino Americans in Hawaii live in multi-generational households, and nearly a third work in the service industry. 34. During the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, Filipino Americans were about a fifth of all COVID-19 cases in Hawaii, 35, 2023 Hawaii wildfires on Maui significantly impacted the Filipino-American community in Lohan, where 40% of the community's population before the wildfires were Filipino-Americans. The United Church of Christ, UCC, is a main Protestant Christian denomination based in the United States, with historical and confessional roots in the Anabaptist, Congregational, Continental Reformed, Luther, and Restorationist traditions, Ithnan, Thalatha, and with approximately 4,600 churches and 712,000 members, Hamsa. The UCC is a historical continuation of the General Council of Congregational Christian Churches founded under the influence of New England Puritanism, Siddha, Sabha, moreover, it also subsumed the third largest Calvinist group in the country, the Dharma Reformed, Sabha, notably. Its modern members have theological and socio-economic stances which are often very different from those of its predecessors. The Evangelical and Reformed Church, General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches, and the Afro-Christian Convention, ثمانية, united on June 25, 1957, to form the UCC, واحد. The Evangelical and Reformed Church and the General Council of Congregational Christian Churches were themselves the result of earlier unions and had their roots in Congregational, Lutheran, Evangelical, and Reformed denominations. At the end of 2014, the UCC's 5116 congregations claimed 979,439 members, primarily in the U.S. In 2025, Pew Research estimated that 7.4% of the U.S. population, or 1.1 million adherents, self-identified with the United Church of Christ, عشرة. The UCC maintains full community with other Protestant denominations, and many of its congregations practice open communion. 11. The denomination emphasizes participation in worldwide interfaith and ecumenical efforts. 12. 13. The national leadership and General Synod of the UCC have historically favored the culturally liberal views on social issues, such as civil rights, LGBT rights, women's rights, and abortion. UCC congregations are independent in matters of doctrine and ministry and may not necessarily support the national body's theological or moral stances. Common theological traditions in the UCC include liberal, 14, liberish, 15, 16, progressive, 17, reformed, 18, and restorationist, 19, 20. The UCC self-describes as an extremely pluralistic and diverse denomination, emphasizing a Christian unity, 21. History. First Church of Christ, Congregational in Manhattan, Connecticut. Men Orticans, Congregational Christian Churches and Evangelical and Reformed Church. The United Church of Christ was formed when three Protestant churches, the Evangelical and Reformed Church, the General Council of the Congregational Christian Churches and the Afro-Christian Convention united on June 25, 1957. 22, 23, 24. The vote on the resolution had no dissenting votes from the delegates gathered. 1. This union adopted a revered general statement of unity between the two denominations. The 1943 basis of Uni, 25. At the time, the UCC claimed about 2 million members. 23. On January 23, 1959, 30 theologians, pastors, and layman finished writing the Usisa's statement of faith. Sitten Waishrun, Saban Waishrin. This statement of faith was written with the intention of including the essential principles wide being, broad enough for persons of varying points of view. Saban Waishrun. It affirms belief in the divinity of Christ and in the Trinitarian concept of God, but it does not explicitly mention the virgin birth of Jesus. Saban Waishrin. The UCC adopted its constitution and bylaws on July 4, 1961, 23 The constitution gives autonomy to local churches, and it provides for a representative type of governance of regional and national church organizations. 28 Prior to the vote. 3669 of 4036 congregational churches voted accepted. 28 There were 367 congregational Christian churches or about 900 that decided to stay at. 28 Some of those churches challenged it in court, saying that it was contrary to traditional congregational principles. 28 Their court challenges were unsuccessful. 28 The vote to adopt the Constitution and bylaws was unanimous among the delegates that met in Philadelphia on July 4, 1961. 28 The Afro-Christian Convention was a long ignored fifth stream that had been neglected for our visibility, resulting in an officially boutage from the denomination at the 2023 General Synod in Indianapolis, Indiana. 29 Beliefs. There is no UCC hierarchy or body that can impose any doctrine or worship format onto the individual congregations within the UCC. 30 Where individual congregations are supposed to hold the cadence from the General Synod. In the Haste Record, the UCC's constitution requires that the autonomy of the local church is inherent and modifiable only by its own action. 31 Seth British Congregational Church and British Hassan Augusta, Men, in 2013. Within this locally focused structure, however, there are central beliefs common to the UCC. The UCC often uses four words to describe itself: Christian, Reformed, Congregational and Evangelical. 32 While the UCC refers its evangelical characteristics, its brand is from, and is considered a part of, mainline Protestantism as opposed to some doctrines in evangelicalism. The word evangelical, in this case, more closely corresponds with the original Lutheran origins meaning of the gospel, as opposed to the evangelical use of the word. UCC is generally theologically liberal, and the denomination notes that the Bible, though written in specific historical times and places, still speaks to us in our present condition. 32 The motto of the United Church of Christ comes from John 21 that they may all be one. The denomination's official literature uses broad doctrinal barometers, emphasizing the freedom of individual conscience and local church autonomy. Citation needed. Historic confessions. In the United Church of Christ, creeds, confessions, and affirmations of faith function as testimonies of faith, around which the Church gathers rather than as tests of faith, rigidly prescribed and required doctrinal consent. As expressed in the United Church of Christ Constitution. The United Church of Christ acknowledges as its sole head, Jesus Christ, Son of God and Savior. It acknowledges as kindred in Christ all who share in this confession. It looks to the Word of God in the Scriptures, and to the presence and power of the Holy Spirit, to prosper its creative and redemptive work in the world. It claims as its one-fifth of the historic church expressed in the ancient creeds and reclaimed in the basic insights of the Protestant reformers. It affirms the responsibility of the church in each generation to make this faith its one verity of worship, in honesty of thought and expression, and in purity of heart before God. In accordance with the teaching of our Lord and the practice prevailing among evangelical Christians, it recognizes two sacraments, baptism and the Loyzaga or Holy Communion, واحد وثلاثون. The denomination, therefore, looks to a number of historic confessions as expressing the common faith around which the Church gathers, including the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Heidelberg Catechism, inherited from both the German Calvinist and German Evangelical heritages, Luther's Small Catechism, inherited from the German Evangelical heritage, the Kansas City Statement of Faith, a 1913 statement in the Congregationalist Tradition, the Evangelical Catechism, a 1927 Catechism in the German Evangelical Tradition, and the Statement of Faith of the United Church of Christ, written at the founding of the denomination. Studies and Surface of Beliefs. In 2001, the Hartford Institute for Religious Research conducted a Faith Communities Study, fact study, 33, that included a survey of United Church of Christ beliefs. Among the results of this were findings that in the UCC, 5.6% of the churches responding to the survey described their members as very liberal or progressive, 3.4% as very conservative, 22.4% as somewhat liberal or progressive, and 23.6% as somewhat conservative. Those results suggested a nearly equal balance between liberal and conservative congregations. However, the self-described moderate group was the largest at 45%. Other statistics found by the Hartford Institute show that 53.2% of members say the Bible is the highest source of authority, 16.1% say the Holy Spirit, 9.2% say reason, 6.3% say experience, and 6.1% say grades. David Rosen, director of the Hartford Institute for Religious Research, who has studied the United Church of Christ, said surveys show the national church's pronouncements are often more liberal than the views in the pews, but that its governing structure is set up to allow such disagreements. 34, starting in 2003. A task force commissioned by General Synod 24 studied the diverse worship habits of UCC churches. The study can be found online, 35, and reflects statistics on attitudes toward worship, baptism, and communion, such as laity, 7%, and clergy, 9%, in a cover-women describe worship as an encounter with God that leads to doing God's work in the world. 95% of our congregations use the revised common lectionary in some way in planning our actual worship and preaching, and 96% always or almost always have ASRM. 86% have a team with children. 95% have a team of sharing the joys and concerns, and 88% include the brother of our Savior, Loyzaga. Clergy and laity were invited to select two meanings of baptism that they emphasize. They were also to suggest the meaning that they thought their entire church emphasized. Baptism as an entry into the Church Universal was the most frequent response. Kurji and Leti were invited to identify meanings of Holy Communion that they emphasize. While Kurji emphasized the Holy Communion as a meal in which we encountered God's living presence, Leti emphasized a remembrance of Jesus' Last Supper, death, and resurrection. Citation needed. A relationship